Everybody knows what the greatest Final Fantasy game is. Everybody knows what the worst Final Fantasy game is. But what is the most underrated mainline Final Fantasy game? What's up guys, I'm Roderick aka Rodman and welcome back to another video. In this video I will be talking about why I believe that Final Fantasy V is the most underrated mainline Final Fantasy game. Let's get right into the video. Before I get into the nitty gritty about the story and gameplay and whatnot of Final Fantasy V, let's talk about the story of the release dates and whatnot and the weird timeline that the Final Fantasy games had in the 90s in the NES and Super Nintendo lifespan. So Final Fantasy 1 came out in 1987 on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and it came out 3 years later to the US in 1990, and it was a smash hit. Final Fantasy 2 and 3 came out in Japan consecutively 1 year after each other, and those were smash hits in Japan, but those games never saw the light of day worldwide, mainly because since Final Fantasy 1 was released so late in the NES's lifespan, Nintendo figured, hey, let's just not release Final Fantasy 2 and 3 to not compete with the Super Nintendo's release. Let's just skip it. So, fast forward to the Super Nintendo for the US and Japan. In Japan, the first Final Fantasy game to be released would be Final Fantasy IV. But here in the US, it would be known as Final Fantasy II, since that technically was the second Final Fantasy game released here. Now, here is when we start to talk about this game, Final Fantasy V. Nintendo intentionally did not release this game outside of Japan because they thought that Westerners could not handle the difficulty of this game. And I'm not going to sit up here and lie, you guys. Final Fantasy V is most definitely the hardest mainline Final Fantasy game. Maybe I'll talk about that a little later or in a separate video. But Final Fantasy V's level of difficulty is quite ridiculous. But I still think they should have released the game. You know, it's an amazing game. But they decided not to release Final Fantasy V anywhere else but Japan. So they skipped right into Final Fantasy VI. So in Japan, they had Final Fantasy VI, but over here we have Final Fantasy III, which was of course one of the greatest games ever made. It was a smash hit. But then when Final Fantasy VII came out, they decided to say, you know what, screw that, we're just gonna call everything, to make everything the same. It's gonna be Final Fantasy VII worldwide. But that's enough for the confusing timeline of the Final Fantasy series. If you want a little bit more in depth, I will probably make another video about it. But let's talk about Final Fantasy V itself. So let's get into the story. The story is about a young man named Bart. He's an adventurer. He has a chocobo named Boko, and it starts off with a meteor crash and an old man named Galuf comes out. I'm not gonna explain the whole story, but long story short is the crystals in this world pretty much trap this guy named X-Death in a realm to keep him from, you know, destroying the world or taking over the world. And just like you've probably assumed, the crystals are being destroyed and X-Death is going to come back, and then that's where we come in to put him back in check. Pretty basic story, nothing crazy, nothing super complicated. It kind of reminds me of Final Fantasy IV, The story isn't super deep, but it's still amazing at the same time. So I think the most important part about this game being so massively underrated is the gameplay. The gameplay elements of this game, while I don't believe it was the most impactful for the series, I do believe that it did make big jumps. Now, I personally believe that Final Fantasy IV is the most impactful Final Fantasy game as far as gameplay, but Final Fantasy V is close behind with the amazing job system. I believe that Final Fantasy V has the best job system in almost any JRPG ever. Now, I am biased, but the job system in this game is amazing, and it does sometimes leads to a few problems, and that's why this game is so difficult, because for some bosses you need a certain job to be mastered, and if you don't like using that job, you're gonna have it all the way to the bottom, and it's gonna be a little wonky. Gonna have to do a bit of grinding and whatnot. A lot of the times you're going to get one shot by bosses, but the main reason I believe that this game is so underrated, not because like, oh, it's overlooked. Well, yeah, it was overlooked because of the fact that it wasn't even released in America until we had the PlayStation 1, which was the late 90s, which was pretty crazy to think that we saw this game being officially released in America around 10 years later than it was released in Japan. But if you are a JRPG fan and you like Final Fantasy, go ahead and pick it up on Steam. I know a lot of people aren't really a big fan of the Steam version. I still think it's great. If you are just super bent on playing another version, then you can go ahead and pick up an emulator and play this game. I recommend the Game Boy Advance version. But this game, I believe, is a must play for Final Fantasy fans. Now, I will say, do not go into this game expecting it to be a breeze. You will die in this game. It's almost inevitable unless you want to sit and grind for hours and hours. You will die a lot in this game. But it's a great game. It has great music, a pretty good story, great characters. So I recommend that you give this game a try. So that's gonna wrap it up for this video, man. If you like this video, don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Tell me what your favorite Final Fantasy game is in the comments down below. Ramen out. Peace.